Hey everyone, Sim for the Future here from the attic on this rather rainy day. So we might get some rain noise in here, who knows. Might actually be relaxing. So the topic of today's video is making music on a budget. Now, for this we need to set some rules and limitations because the topic of making music itself is very big and a budget is also a very subjective thing. You might look at this setup and think, well, who is he to talk about making music on a budget? Again, it's very subjective. This is my budget, but I'm very aware that for many people this is way outside their budget. And that's actually the category I'm very interested in to talk about, because there's a lot of content about things on a budget that are very Western oriented budgets that even make me go, well, that's a bit much, isn't it? So we're going to keep it as close to zero as possible, but there's definitely going to be some expenses along the way. So it's not going to be zero, but we'll try to make it as reasonable as possible. In making this video, I am going to suggest some gear, but I'm going to stay away from very specific suggestions because availability might be a thing. You are going to have to rely on the second-hand market a little bit. And because making music is a very creative thing, not everything works for everyone. So some gear might be very good for me, maybe this thing, although arguably, and it might be very bad for what you are doing. As for the boundaries we're setting today, we're talking about a DAW-based electronic music setup. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't be able to take clues from this video for other things, but that's the main focus. So we're not going to talk about DAWless jamming and a lot of hardware gear. It's mainly about DAW-based, so using a digital audio workstation on your computer to make mostly electronic music. Another kind of limitation I'll have to set to the scope of this video is that we're going to talk about a Windows-based system, because I simply lack experience with Mac. I've never owned one in my life, and I know even less about Linux. It is just not a good idea for me to talk about that subject. If you're going down the Mac route, like I said, it's best to consult some Mac-related forums and YouTubers. But one thing that might be interesting to consider is a Mac Mini. It would be highly recommended to look at the M1 version, which would be around 2020, so it's a little bit older, but it's a lot better than the earlier Intel models. So that's going to be a big difference if you're into the Apple ecosphere. That might be a good place to start with these things. But how it stacks up to other options, I just can't say. I'll try to find some resources and leave them down below. To help you along the way if you're on a Mac-based environment. Although in all fairness, if you're on a very thin budget, the odds of being on Mac is, I think, smaller. But there might still be people that are into that. Yeah, probably not the best video to watch. I'm sorry for that. When we're talking about computers, that's a whole new rabbit hole we're opening up, so we're going to keep it to the basics, because there are a lot of possible configurations. You can buy basically anything, going all the way back to the Core 2 Duo days, but of course not everything is going to be functional these days. So buying something like this, it's very shiny, yeah, it's probably not going to be any good. I think this chip is worth literal dollars at this point, just because it's practically useless for most things. So if you're looking into computers specifically, your best bet is probably going to be the second-hand office PC market, if you're looking for complete systems and not building something yourself. In general, building something yourself is cheaper than pre-built, but in most cases buying stock from an office that is selling off PCs is cheaper than building a PC from parts. Now, it's not going to be the most recent hardware, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. There are some general guidelines though when we're talking about PC setups, and the PC or laptop, desktop, whatever you're going to use, is going to be the brains of the operations. This is where you run your DAW on, your music program, and where you will be running your software instruments. So it is going to be the thing you are probably going to spend the bulk of your money on. Now, you might already have a computer, in which case, very nice. If you don't, you kind of have to choose between two camps. We have the desktop camp and we have the laptop camp. The advantage of desktops in general is that you get more power for your money, and you have the added benefit of being able to swap out parts, which can be very handy if you have the means to upgrade along the way. The downside, of course, is that you're not just going to buy a desktop, you're also going to have to buy a screen and a keyboard and a mouse, and that's going to add expense. The second-hand market is definitely your best friend here, and you should probably watch some videos by content creators who are very computer focused, although the overlap of computer focused and music is not that big. It's usually about gaming, and there is a bit of a difference between gaming and making music. So for starters, for making music, I think in general you are still going to be just fine with 16 gigs of RAM. There might be people that say, well, you're going to need more, but that's usually only when you have a lot of very large sample-based instruments. And realistically, when you're working on a budget, that's not going to happen any day soon. So I wouldn't be too afraid to stick to 16 for now. You can also, of course, upgrade along the way. And it seems in the DDR4 world that going from 16 to 32 is basically a 2x multiplier. So it is worth going for 16, so you'll have more money to spend on the other things you're going to need. Now, once you have a PC or a Mac or a laptop or whatever, if you have a laptop, you already have a screen. If you don't have a screen, you are going to have to get a screen. Now, I would even go as far as to say get a multi-screen setup if the space allows it. Now, this might be the point where you say that doesn't sound exactly budget. That's true. But screens are actually surprisingly cheap because you can cut a lot of corners. You don't need high refresh rate screens for music production, and you don't need super color accurate screens for music productions. I would even go as far as to say you can buy a second-hand TV and it will work fine. It's not good for gaming, but it's fine for production and that sort of things. The setup I've going here is actually my very old TN panel in the center. That's my old main computer screen, which I've replaced quite a few years ago. And in the older pictures you will see two 3:2 ratio screens on the side. Those were actually screens I picked up for about $10 from a local marketplace. They aren't fancy or anything, but they can display a picture, and that's really all that matters. Having two screens, so even with a laptop I would say, if you can get a second screen, just opens up space to permanently place a mixer or track routing or that sort of stuff, and it just makes things a little bit easier to work with. On a laptop screen, you often run into space issues as well, so if you can afford it and if you can find a place for it, any screen, I would say at least with a 1080p resolution, will aid with working faster and more easily without getting too frustrated with a lot of overlapping screens and a lot of clicking back and forwards. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, here are some listings I could find online without too much trouble, and you can see it's not a huge expense in many cases. And you might even be able to find a school or a company or whatever that's selling off a large amount of screens for not that much money. Because this is a video on the YouTubes, we are going to talk strictly about bought software. We are not going to sell the 7Cs, and I'm not going to help you crack things. Not because I think every company is deserving of your money, but it's just the right thing to do. If everyone is going to take everything from everyone, it's just going to be a shit show. Companies will go bankrupt, and in the end we will have less to work with instead of more. And there's also a lot of smaller developers who are very seriously impacted by people taking their stuff. So we're strictly on the legal here. If you are on a very serious budget, I can understand people going for the pirating way. It's just not what we're going to talk about here. Alright, several months of disclaimers later, let's get into it, shall we? It's always fun when you have so many disclaimers that it takes a little while to set up, but we can go now. So the first thing you need to buy is a computer. Now in general I would say newer is better, and when we're talking strictly music making, you're probably better off with fewer faster cores than many slower cores. So that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's generally how it works. So on the Intel side, I would say more performance cores in general beats more efficiency cores, so try to aim for that. On the AMD side, it is always a matter of looking at good clock speeds. If you have 2 times the cores at half the clock speed, you're better off having half the cores at double the clock speed. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's in general what it boils down to. Now there's also instructions per clock, which makes this thing incredibly difficult. This basically means that a slower processor can possibly do more calculations per clock cycle. Yeah, I would say look up some comparisons to see how these things perform in workloads, because that's generally what we're looking at. And a lot of the music-based stuff is still single-threaded, single-core based. So that's the metric you want to look at. You can either go PC or a laptop, that's fine. Just look at what your environment is you're building in. And if you are going to want something to take with you, just buy a laptop instead of having to invest into 2 systems, which is ultimately going to make things more difficult to maintain and also more expensive. The first thing we need when we're going to make music is an audio interface. Now you might think, why do I need an audio interface? It's fairly simple and straightforward, because it handles audio a lot better than any built-in audio interface into your motherboard. It's a really big difference, and it will save you a lot of headaches to just nail this down right at the beginning of your journey, because you're going to run into weird buffer issues and all sorts of oddness, which will be very frustrating. So definitely look for an audio interface. Now, at the time of writing, I think there is one audio interface which is something I can generally recommend, and that's the Behringer UMC 204 HD. Do notice you need to get the 204, not the 202, and that's because the 204 has integrated MIDI, which is going to be important a little bit later on in this talk. These interfaces, there's also the Scarlett, it doesn't have MIDI I think, generally have 2 inputs, meaning you can connect either one stereo instrument or you can connect 2 mono instruments, let's say a microphone and a guitar, for instance. So it is a little bit limited. If you have the money to spend and you're planning on doing more than just one instrument or more than a guitar and a voice, you are probably best off right from the get-go to invest into something with 4 inputs. This allows you to have either 2 stereo or 2 mono and a stereo, for instance. So it gives a little bit more flexibility to work with. Now, I am aware there's a lot of controversy around the Behringer brand, and I can understand you feeling uncomfortable giving your money to Uli Behringer, but you know, there is a time for ethical based buying, and if you're on a budget, that definitely isn't the time if you ask me. So yeah, basically it's the best route to go if you want to buy new. Secondhand, of course, you are going to have to investigate your local market. I would say 2 inputs and MIDI is definitely the lower bar in this category of items you definitely need to acquire. One sort of very specific thing with audio interfaces, if you're planning on doing live streaming or screen recording with your DAW going, it's probably best to make the investment early on and to go with a interface that has a virtual loopback option. Especially on Windows, this will save you a lot of trouble, because quite often if you're running a DAW, it will take priority over your audio interface, meaning that once you start to try and stream that same audio stream or record it with like OBS, it will give issues either on the DAW side or the recording side. This is a very annoying issue to deal with. I know, because I've been there, and the best way to get around this is getting an interface that has a virtual loopback. One of the options is PreSonus. The 86C, for instance, is a smaller, somewhat more affordable model that has virtual loopback. So that might be something you want to invest in if you are planning on streaming with your PC in a live setting or doing screen recording with live sound. Now, if you already have a lot of gear, having 2 or 4 inputs is not going to be enough for you. In this situation, I would definitely recommend checking out second-hand options, and I would say, for instance, a PreSonus 1824 like I have is a very solid audio interface with a lot of features which can be found for 300-ish second-hand if you're a little bit lucky. But you're going to have to rely on luck here, because that's what it is. If you have a lot of gear you want to use at the same time, it might be interesting to look into an audio mixer. Behringer has a rack mixer which is very cheap, which allows you to mix a lot of inputs to the two inputs of your audio interface. So this way you can get quite a few inputs for not that much money. The alternative is going the patch bay route, where you can switch between inputs, which for a DAW-based workflow works just fine and is often a little bit cheaper than buying mixers, although there's a big second-hand market in mixers as well. I don't think focusing on hardware gear is the best choice in this stage and on a budget, so I would definitely recommend not focusing too much on the hardware bit and focusing more on software and being software compatible. But make sure you have a interface which at least features MIDI, because that's going to feed into the next part, and that's control. Now, if you are going to make music, you can do that in a workstation, you can do it with your keyboard, your mouse, you can click things around. If you want to have a little bit more of a feeling that you're a musician and you can play things, and that can also be just a little bit faster to just play things or experiment things on a keyboard, you probably want to have some sort of MIDI controller. Now, this is again where you have a lot of options, but I think by far the cheapest option is getting a cheap keyboard. Not a JDXA, because it's not cheap. What I'm talking about here are your Casio starter keyboards, for instance, because many of those keyboards feature a DIN MIDI port. And if it has a DIN MIDI port and your audio interface has a DIN MIDI, and that's why we want the 204 and not the 202 for Behringer, you can connect any keyboard with DIN MIDI to it and use it as a controller, which opens up a very large possible pool of MIDI controllers, because now basically any keyboard you can find that has DIN MIDI can be used to control your software instruments. So this opens up the window of going onto your secondhand items website for your locality and just typing something in like keyboard or synthesizer or whatever is the preferred term in your locality. And you might be able to even find very cheap or even free synthesizers there with a DIN MIDI port, which means you can use them with your interface as a control unit, which is very good when you're starting out, because it's going to save you money. If you do want to buy a specific MIDI keyboard, yeah, it's a little bit tricky. You are probably going to run into the Keystep clone by Behringer again, because they're very good at stealing good designs for not that much money. So that's a possibility. If you don't mind smaller keys, the MPK Mini is a very good option. And there's also the Keylabs by Arturia, but you're already spending quite a substantial amount of money for that. If you're really on a budget, just make sure your interface has MIDI and just buy any keyboard with MIDI or pick it up at your local scrapyard. I don't know, just get something that gets the job done, because that's all that matters at a low budget. And after all, it's MIDI. No one's going to hear it. That's what the instruments are for. So now we have something to run our DAW on. We have a interface, we have a input device. Let's just quickly touch on non-electronic music, and let's quickly talk about other instruments you might want to have to buy. Now, one of these instruments can be a bass guitar or an electric guitar or anything in the likes. What is important to keep in mind here is that these things are basically money sinks. That's what they are. You can spend a lot of money on guitars and basses and all that sort of stuff, where in reality it is not going to make that big a difference. Especially when you're starting out. Get something you're comfortable with, get something that gets the job done, and definitely look into the second-hand market. This bass is second-hand, my guitars are second-hand, I only have one bass that's actually new, and that's the bass that is broken. So yeah, it's not a guarantee to buy new stuff and have shiny toys at all. This bass about 400 euros is not on cheap end, but you can find Ibanez basses for about 200 bucks that are very solid. Guitars as well. Don't stare too much at the shiny expensive toys, because it is not going to matter nearly as much as you think in this stage. I would highly recommend checking out Glenn Fricker. He's a bit abrasive, but in general he knows a thing or two about guitar retorting. So that's my recommendation. Don't spend too much money on your instruments in this stage of your music production journey. Look at secondhand, find something you like enough and get that. Any guitar can be connected to most interfaces. Just make sure there's an instrument setting on the interface and you can just plug it straight in. I know there's going to be people extremely mad about me saying that, but that's the way to go. Don't bother buying expensive DI boxes in this stage. And don't bother spending a lot of money on reamp boxes and that sort of stuff in the budget and starting part of your journey. Get something that gets the job done. So much for the illusion that this was all shot in a single take on a single day, I guess. There's actually two things I forgot in this list when I was filming the other day. The first thing we shortly need to touch on is external effects. So what we're talking about here is like guitar stompbox effects and the likes, but also rack effect units and all that sort of outboard stuff. Now, for music production, if you're just solely looking at recording things and putting tracks out, I would definitely recommend to just stay away from them, especially on a smaller budget. Even though there are some pretty affordable options like these Harley Benton pedals, they are fairly cheap, and honestly the Evil Twin is kind of cool. You are going to compromise quite a bit on the quality of the product. So even these pedals that are like 25-30 bucks, although cheap, you can get better effects on your PC probably for free or close to that price point, let alone that you'll need some sort of power supply, you need some sort of maybe pedal board concept to stick it on, which you can build yourself, but still it's all extra components with extra failure points and extra expensive with patch cables and all that sort of stuff. Potential noise to deal with, complexities, difficulties in recording and all that sort of stuff. So if you're on a very tight budget, I would say just stay away from this sort of stuff when you're starting out. Now, if you're planning to bring things to the road, so on shows or live gigs or that sort of stuff, and you're planning to use those effects live, well then it's probably something you might want to invest in. In all other situations, just do it in a DAW and it will make your life both easier and it's a lot more cost efficient than buying specific pedals. Now, the other category I haven't covered yet are microphones. So you might want to produce music that includes vocals of any sort and kind. Now, I'm not a vocalist by any stretch of the imagination. I try to dabble with it, but so far nothing has made it to any form of recording yet. But if that's something you want to do, you probably need a microphone. Now, I'm no microphone expert and there are many channels around, so for more detailed reviews for that sort of stuff, I definitely recommend just Googling. But for the basic pointers at the very lowest budget point, there is the phone. Now, this might seem kind of crazy, but if you're on a very tight budget, this thing does have a microphone. And there are some videos online which point to fairly decent results using a microphone like this. Downside being that these microphones are very small, so they don't have the full dynamic range of a bigger microphone. So it is a limitation, but yeah, if you're on a very tight budget, you could probably get away with it, especially at the very beginning when listener numbers are probably not that great. People are not going to be that scared away from not the most sublimely sounding vocals in the world. If you want to up the game a little bit, you are going to need a microphone, and preferably a condenser microphone, because due to the larger diaphragms, they are just more sensitive. They capture the frequency spectrum a little bit better and they are better at dynamics. So if you go from loud to quiet, they are better at capturing that. Now, your options here are somewhat more limited and probably more expensive than the true budget, but that's just the price you're going to have to pay if you're into vocals, I guess. Upside of microphones is they basically last as long as you don't submerge them in water or throw with them. So it's a one-time investment that will go a long way. Your lowest level entry microphones, and I don't think I would even recommend this, but there is the Behringer XM 8500 for about 24 bucks. This is a Shure SM85 clone. It's a held-hand dynamic microphone, and it is the sort of thing that is used in a lot of venues for vocals and stuff like that, but I think it's probably not your best choice for studio work. I would definitely recommend going up one step to a true condenser microphone like the Audio-Technica AT2020. At around 90 bucks, it's a big leap, I will admit. But it will give you a proper dynamic microphone, and actually this is the sort of microphone that a lot of YouTube singers sing on, and you will see it featured all over the place. Highly reliable and very good in quality. If you want to go a little bit higher on the scale, probably something like a Lewitt LTC 420, also a microphone beloved with many vocalists around the world. It's more expensive at 129, 130-ish EU, so it's an investment to make. Once again, the advantage is once you have a microphone and a cable, you're pretty much done with that. At the even higher tier, we're not going to go all the way into ridiculous. I would say a Austin Origin at about 220, 230 is a very, very nice higher level microphone. Now the thing with microphones is it's very specific to your singer, the characteristics you're trying to capture and the kind of performance you're trying to capture, but that's a little guideline without going into too much details at what sort of price points you can probably pick something up that will be somewhat budget and still give you a good performance. So we now have a computer or a laptop to run our DAW on. We have something to play in our music. We have an audio interface. The last thing we need to quickly talk about in the hardware realm before we move on to the software realm is audio. You are going to have to observe the audio you make in order to be able to do something with it. Now there are many camps in this, and once again it's a big rabbit hole, but we're talking budget here. We want efficiency, and we want the most for the least amount of money. And this is once again going to be a hot topic, but I would say don't buy speakers for this purpose. Just don't, because it is going to cause way more problems than you're going to have to be able to deal with, especially in the beginning. Because if you go down the speaker rabbit hole, it's a rabbit hole. You're going to have to treat your room, prevent reflections, you need a very quiet workspace. It's all going to be a lot of things to deal with. Instead, go for headphones. Headphones can be bought fairly cheaply. They just work. They don't give the best stereo image, etc., so you're going to have a little bit of a handicap. But realistically, when you're starting out on your music journey, people are not going to be playing your music in giant venues. They are going to listen to it on headphones. They are going to listen to it on cheap mono speakers or on their phone even, which is horrible, terrible, but reality. So don't spend thousands of dollars on expensive monitors, just get headphones. Now these headphones are actually a very good bargain option. This is the Samsung SR850. I'm not sure it's available worldwide, but I would recommend that this is about 40 bucks. Which is, I think, about as cheap as you can go before you really get into the sketchy things. Of course, if you have more money to spend, Audio-Technica DT770s or DT990s are definitely very solid options. But I think this is about as cheap as you can go and still get a somewhat reasonable representation of your music without breaking the bank completely. I'm very much aware that 40 bucks is probably still quite a bit for some people, but yeah, it's going to be the thing where you can actually check your quality of work. So this and an audio interface are things you are going to have to spend some amount of money on. Way at the start of your journey, you can probably still get away with some earbuds or cheaper headphones, but if you are going to be a little bit serious about it, do consider buying something a little bit more expensive, just to make sure you at least get somewhat of a representation of what most people will hear when they listen to your tracks. That's a good option. If you are fortunate enough to have a fairly maintained room and you have a bit more budget and you want to go down the speaker way, well, I'm not your guy. I can't tell you. I do everything on headphones just because it's a lot more convenient. And if I want to check things on speakers, I will just go to my home stereo and play it there. And most often I will do that. I will listen to it on a small little JBL speaker, and that's about all the referencing I do. Because realistically, I'm not expecting anyone to listen to anything I make on a $10,000 stereo system. It's just reality. Once your music reaches that point, your budget should have grown to the point where you can buy something more fitting for that production situation. So that about covers everything hardware related. I would highly recommend to not look into too much in the hardware audio gear realm, because basically adding any hardware component multiplies the effort to keep things working, and it will in general slow down your workflow, especially when you're starting out and you don't have access to really high-end gear. You can buy, for instance, a synth, although I would say stick to a single one, considering the interface options I gave you. It just saves on things to mangle with, and it will eat into other things you will have to invest in. So let's get into software at last. Basically 3 flavors which we need to cover. You have the subscriptions based, you have a pay once, have everything option, and you have a pay once less, but potentially have to spend more over the long term to fill in the gaps of the software. Now, subscriptions are always a little bit of a tricky topic to navigate. I'm personally not a big fan of recurring costs, so I try to stay away from them where possible. Although it's hard to deny that there isn't value in them, because let's say you're on a really thin budget, it's probably easier to muster $10 a month versus spending 500 or 600 euros at once. That totally makes sense. The other upside of subscriptions is, if they are on a monthly basis, it gives you the opportunity to try software and find out whether it works for you or not without having to spend 600 or 700 euros on it, which is, again, a big advantage. If you're looking into subscription models, I would say do your research and see how long it takes for the subscriptions to become more expensive than just outright buying it, and look if that's a balance you can live with. There are many DAWs that offer subscription options. I would say 2 notable examples here are Fruity Loops. They have a subscription that includes quite a lot of plugins, as you can see, including some instruments and effects. And you can of course enhance this with some free stuff that I will show off later, also some sound packs, and this is at $12.50 a month, or discounted right now. The other one that's noteworthy is Reason, although it's quite a lot more expensive at almost 20 euros a month. It does include the DAW, plugins, sound packs and all sorts of stuff to get you going. The nice thing here is that with subscriptions you can usually end them at any time if you go for a monthly plan, so you can just use it as an extension of the trial period, because all DAWs have a trial period, so I always recommend trialing first. If you can't afford it in one go, it might be interesting to look into something like a subscription plan if that's available. Financially, in most cases, outright buying is usually the cheaper option. There are also some sites that offer the options to finance bigger purchases, like for instance on Splice you can finance Bitwig Studio, 25 months of $15.99. It's still fairly expensive because you have a long-term commitment, so I would be careful with things like that, but there's definitely options there. Now, if we're talking about buying, probably the one to look at is Ableton Live. Now, the reason why I say Ableton Live, even though I don't use it myself, is because I've asked a fair few people. An Ableton Live suite is basically the one thing most people seem to want to take to a desert island if they were to take only a laptop and one piece of recording software. And that's easy to understand, because the Ableton Live suite is very, very comprehensive. It gives you a large amount of instruments, effects, modulation, all sorts of very useful things, and they are all very solid. For the Ableton Live suite, you pay $599 US dollars, which isn't exactly cheap, but it does give you everything. It's basically, if you buy that, you can still go for the free suggestions, which will follow a little bit later in this video, but you're essentially done. That's all you need to start making music right now. Now, $599 also includes Max for Live, which is their ecosystem for community-made instruments and effects and stuff, which adds another layer of value on top of it, because there's a lot of very good stuff in Max for Live. And aside from that, you can also make your own devices. So if you're into learning more about DSP or trying to create your own effects, that could be a very cool incentive to dive into that ecosphere. The cheaper option, if you are on a stringy budget, would be Reaper by Cocos, and this is basically a program made by the people behind Winamp, who were left with a fair amount of money once they sold off Winamp, and they went, well, let's do something for the community, which is cool. So basically they made Reaper, which is a DAW that is extremely feature rich, and you can try it for free. And the most impressive thing here is you can actually extend the trial as long as you want, basically using the full software for free. Now, they will give you a little next screen once you pass the 60 or something days. So you have to wait a few seconds before you can launch the software, but this way you can completely legitimately use a DAW without pirating, which is very cool. The only kind of downside with Reaper is that it isn't as feature rich as Ableton. It doesn't include instruments, it doesn't include big sample packs and stuff like that. It's very bare bones in that regard, but it does advanced routing. It has a lot of utility effects in it, like compressors and all that sort of stuff. That's all included. And it has a very deep MIDI editor and also a lot of tools for sample clipping and remapping and that sort of stuff. So one thing I forgot to mention here, and that's kind of important, is that Reaper is a paid DAW. They just allow you to run in the trial mode pretty much forever. If you want to register a copy of Reaper, which I think you should if you use it a lot, it's $60 for a non-commercial license, which is pretty much what you can use if your yearly gross revenue does not exceed 20,000 US dollars, which is kind of unlikely. If it does, it's a commercial license, $225. But in most cases, $60 gets you about 3 or 4 years in updates. So it's very cost effective. And again, you can run it for free basically as long as you have to, until you have the funds to pay off your Reaper debt. So it's a very deep, very usable DAW, just isn't a download it and be done with it thing, like for instance Ableton Live is, where you can just get that, be done with it. So if you're interested into the Reaper ecosphere, I would highly recommend checking out some of the freebies, which is the next part, because there's a lot of software which is rather expensive, but there's also a lot of software which is free, and free is always good. So let's take a look at some of the free software options in the synthesizers, effects and drum categories. And after that we can take a little bit of a look at buying smart. So let's finally move into the PC. Alright, so welcome to the DAW. Reaper, as you can see. And it's important to note here, now that we're talking about software, that this is not an exhaustive list. This isn't all the software you can possibly get, because that would be a list that is so long that I would be reading for several weeks, if not months. There's a lot out there that you can grab for free, and I think it's most important to give you a great resource where you can find a lot of this stuff without having to search the entire web. And for that, I would like to point you to the Bedroom Producers blog. Fantastic website. No, I don't ad block, because these guys deserve every cent of ad revenue there is. They feature tons of free stuff, tons of great deals. So yeah, definitely check them out. They were also a contributor to the knowledge in this video, because, well, there's just a lot of articles, so you can find a lot of stuff there. Big recommendation. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the things we can get for free that I think are definitely worth picking up. Again, it's not everything you can get, it's just to give you a little bit of a taste of what you can get. I think the first company we should probably cover is UHC, something along those lines. They make great analog style VSTs, of course known for Diva, but they also have some freebies, like for instance Tyrell N6. Now this is a very cool little synth with all the basics you might need. So in this specific patch I use it for a little bass loop and for some other parts. And it has been a great experience. It has basically all the features you need to get started, and if you combine this with the other free synth I want to highlight, Vital, you can get a lot of sounds done. So this is Vital by Vital Audio. I've showcased it before. I think this is pretty much the best free synth there is. It's basically Serum, but for free. It has a lot of features when it comes to subtractive synthesis and FM synthesis, and it does a lot of cool wavetable stuff. Has built-in effects, which is a big plus, and there's a large suite of presets available, so you can just grab it and have a go at it. You can also pay for Vital, in which case the plus version is $25, which gives you access to quite a few extra presets and more wavetables. So I definitely highly recommend checking out Vital. If you're looking for an FM synth, basically the DX7 is the go-to old school FM synth, and for the DX7 you can grab DAWS, which is also a free plugin. It also loads all the original patches, so you can scour the web for DX7 patches and you can find 60 years worth of patches, free for use in most cases. FM synthesis is a little bit magical and weird and complex, but just sticking to the presets you can already get a lot of use out of this. One synth I didn't use in this specific patch, which is also worth pointing out, is ZebraLED by UHC. This is a great synthesizer which showcases some of the Zebra oscillators that allows you to do some really wacky sound design as well as getting some really cool synth sounds. Also freebie with the great UEA sound quality, so highly recommended. When it comes to effects, there are a bunch of companies which I really need to highlight, and I have highlighted them before, and I will keep highlighting them till the end of time. The first being Melda Productions. Melda Productions makes the M3 bundle. The M3 bundle is absolutely amazing. I actually did a track where I only used basically the Melda free bundle for all the effects and processing and stuff. It's a very comprehensive bundle with all the basic effects, the compressors, the reverb, all that sort of stuff. Really, really solid stuff. Very deep, very usable. Highly recommended as well. To once again mention a company that does way too much for everyone, it's Tel. The Tel reverb in this case is also a freebie. Cool, old school reverb for those kind of vintage sounds. Quite a lot of control, and actually for a free reverb, really good sounding. Reverbs are always a little bit tricky to get right. This one is definitely worth mentioning as well. Another company that does a lot of free stuff is Kilohertz. KHS is their short tag, Kilohertz. They have a free effects bundle which is absolutely ludicrously big. It has no right to be that big and free at the same time. It covers all your basic effects, your filters, your compressors, and even a transgator and a whole bunch of extra stuff. It's actually honestly quite insane what they bring to the table. Chorus, convolver reverb, distortion, basically any effect you might want to use, you can find it at the Kilohertz bundle, and you can download that for free as well. And the last effects I want to shout out for now is the Valhalla Supermassive. Valhalla is a great reverb company. They make some of the best reverbs out there. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But they have a freebie as well, which is the Valhalla Supermassive. This is a combination of reverb and delay. There's a whole bunch of modes with all sorts of wacky sounding reverb delay combinations. It always has just the thing you need to create atmospheres or interesting reverb sounds. Definitely something I would highly recommend downloading. Even if you have a big suite of paid plugins, this is just one you shouldn't pass on. Now, the last kind of effect I want to talk about is Blue Arp by OMG Instruments. Now, Blue Arp isn't an effect that makes sound by itself. It's a MIDI arpeggiator / step sequencer, and it is absolutely amazing at doing what it has to do to create interesting ARP sequences. So, for instance, with the Tyrell, it doesn't have a built-in arpeggiator. So, arpeggiators are one of those things, if you are into classic electronic music, you are going to need one, because that's just the sound, right? So, the cool thing about Blue Arp is not only does it have a lot of control over your arpeggiator with step lengths and all sorts of settings here, you can also chain different arpeggiators to create evolving arpeggios, which is a pretty cool thing. So what I have going on here, for instance, is a sequence of arpeggiators to make a longer arpeggio sequence. I think that's a very cool feature, and this thing is completely free as well. Big shout out to OMG Instruments. I think aside from the Pigments arpeggiator, this is probably the arpeggiator I use the most. It's just really good and absolutely free. So definitely check it out. Now, aside from the free level, there's also, of course, the smart buy category of things. For this, I want to shout out one site in particular. There are more sites. Actually, I'll shout out two sites. The first site I will shout out is the Plugin Alliance. Now, I have a bit of a hate-love relationship with Plugin Alliance, but it's kind of hard to deny that they do run good deals. So yeah, I can't leave them out just because I don't agree with everything they do, because they do some stuff which is pretty amazing. So, first thing to note at the Plugin Alliance is that they actually have a free bundle as well. So it's not the biggest bundle, but it does give you a jumping off point with a few easy to use things, including BX Rock Rack for if you're a guitarist. It gives you just a few free things. And Clean Sweep is a pretty nice filter utility thing as well. Aside from that, they quite often run sales on many of their things. And here I want to highlight one of the companies which I am affiliated to, so I need to tread a little bit carefully. But they also feature everything from Unfiltered Audio. And Unfiltered Audio is a company which makes some pretty interesting stuff, like, for instance, Zip is something I use a lot, Sandman Pro, Silo, and Lion, the synthesizer, is excellent as well. If you're into more lo-fi stuff, lo-fi is actually very solid. And Bio or Triad, although I would still recommend Biome at this point, are great multi-effects. And the thing with Plugin Alliance is their sales are often pretty deep, so even though the sticker prices seem pretty high, you can quite often find pretty decent discounts. So you can keep your eye on this site. But the real star of the show is the Plugin Boutique. Now, Plugin Boutique is one of those sites you just, if you're on a budget, want to check regularly. They have deals often, and they do really deep discounts, and this makes a lot of software a lot more accessible. There's also a complete free section, so you can just click the free, and you can click the category, for instance, effects. And we'll just get a big list of free effects that you can check out. Crush is actually a very nice bit crusher. Tell Chorus, and as you can see, it's a very extensive list as well. Now, one of the things to keep an eye on with Plugin Boutique are a few software recommendations I will do. The first one being Excellent Audio's XO. If you're going to use drum samples, I think XO is probably one of the best drum sample management softwares out there, with a nice little sequencer built in, and in fact it's very flexible. Now the sticker price is pretty high, but I think it drops down to something like maybe $50 on discounts depending on the season. So Black Friday, Cyber Monday is always a good time to keep an eye out on the Plugin Boutique website and on the Excellent Audio website to see if there's a deal around. While talking about drums and deals, another website I would highly recommend to keep an eye on is Samples from Mars. Basically, if you're looking for old school drum samples, Samples from Mars is the place to be. They have the old drums pack, which is already decently priced for the amount of drums in here. It's really extensive, with all the old school drum machines at your disposal, combined with XO. That gives you, well, basically all the drums you need for more old school stuff. So that's a very good site to keep an eye on. And another site I want to mention is Ghost Hack. This is also a sample seller. Now, I think the most notable thing here are the drum packs, and especially the Drum Hero stuff can be very interesting if you are starting out. Very reasonably priced packs, and these packs are also pretty extensive. 1500 drum samples and one-shots. Big packs, great sound quality. Definitely gives you a good starting place, so I would highly recommend checking these out as well. Now, there's one company that doesn't do sales, but still one I think is well worth investing in, and that's Valhalla, and especially Vintage Verb. Now, the name might be a little bit misleading. Vintage Verb is not just about vintage, it's just one of the best reverbs out there. A lot of modes, a lot of different types of reverb, and a very good feature set. I would say if you had to go by with just one reverb plugin, this is definitely the one to keep an eye on. $50, I would say even at $200, this would be a fair deal. So big ups to Valhalla for not inflating their prices. And the coolest thing here is Valhalla constantly updates their plugins with new modes and new things. So even though this is a very old plugin, they recently even added some new reverb modes, and that's really cool of them. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the iZotope Elements suite. Now, again, the default price for this bundle is quite steep. If you're on a tight budget, I can totally see that this is way above your pay grade. But again, this is one of those things where you want to keep an eye on both the iZotope website, but also on Plugin Boutique, because I have seen the price of iZotope Elements drop as low as $3. That has happened in the past, and sometimes it's free when purchasing something fairly cheap. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I do have a love-hate relationship with iZotope, and that's just the way they do their upgrade prices. Is kind of unfair to people who are already in the ecosystem, because the upgrade price from nothing to a full suite is generally much lower than if you already own a full suite and you want to update to the latest version, which is very annoying. But at the same time, I can't fault them for making really important tools actually pretty accessible in the scope of the music production landscape. So it's one of those things that I think is worth picking up. Great mastering tools, great tools for finding a good balance in your instruments. Definitely not needed. Much of the stuff can also be done with the Melder bundle, for instance. But it's just something that makes things a lot faster. So if you can find this for like $40, definitely highly recommend picking it up. Now, one last thing I kind of need to mention as well. If you're interested into modular synthesis, there is the VCV route, but you can also check out Voltage Modular by Cherry Audio. they have a free version of their Voltage Nucleus bundle. It's a bit limited, but it does give you a good entry into modular synthesis to get a little bit of a feel for it. Now, I am a bit biased to Voltage because, of course, my modules and hardware, our crossover runs on Voltage Modular. So I'm a bit biased there. VCV is also a great option. You won't find our micro modules on VCV. So yeah, you can check this out for free. Definitely recommend just picking it up if you're into modular. That could be a good starting point. So there you have it. That's a look at some software recommendations and some software options. Once again, this is far from the entire list of things you can pick up for free. The list is basically endless. Just stay wary. There are, of course, things around that are not as trustworthy as other things. I would once again recommend checking out the Bedroom Producer blog. Generally, what they post is safe to use. So that's a good starting point for your budget music production journey. To end this off, I just want to play you off with this song, which is in my current filming state, not quite done yet, but by the time you see this video, it will be. And I will try to do this with as much free software as I can. One caveat here is that I did use Atlas by Orgonaut. Now, this software isn't needed. It's just like EXO, a drum sample library, and I didn't feel like searching the web for samples, which can easily be done. I just wanted to have something and get going with the more important free things to showcase. So a little bit of a cheat there, but you can just do this with samples in your DAW just fine. It works just as well. So that's it for this video. A rather long one, but hopefully it was a bit educational and gave you a bit of a starting point on your music journey. If you have any questions, drop them down below, and I'll see you in the next one.